To kick off our first conversation, please welcome founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, Ernest Moniz, and Time's Justin Worland.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are here to talk about the geopolitical upheaval of this year, which has obviously had really significant implications for energy markets and, by extension, climate. And it's hard to imagine someone who's better positioned to talk about some of these issues than Ernie Moniz, who, in his time as Energy Secretary, negotiated the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, and then also led the response to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. So he's got a lot of insight into all of the sort of most pertinent topics. I want to start maybe just with the war in Iran, which obviously has defined the year for energy markets. And just, it makes a case for a transition to alternative energy sources. Kind of inherently, we see the volatility, the challenges with oil and with hydrocarbons, thanks to the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Is this an inflection point of some sort? And if so, what sort?
Well, thanks, Justin, for the question. First of all, as an inflection, for the inflection point, I would just recall, you mentioned the 2014 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That was a time when the G7 and the EU got together in response to that, relooked at energy security, and I think it was the first time it was written down at the level of governments, at least, that going to a low-carbon energy economy was an important security move as well as important for the climate, because, as you imply, you're not vulnerable to the same kinds of fluctuations you are with fossil fuels. I think you could have asked the question, is this an inflection point then? The answer is it wasn't. We've continued to make progress on climate, of course, but nothing like at the pace that we would like or that the Ukraine invasion might have justified. Now, today, we're at a different point. First of all, technology has progressed a lot in the last decade, particularly on the electricity side, the renewables, storage, EVs, et cetera. So the situation is primed for a push on low carbon energy. However, there is also a countercurrent, and this reminds us that just as the climate and the energy security discussion are not separate, as we just discussed, neither is the social equity or affordability issue separate from that one conversation. And consequently, as LNG prices, liquefied natural gas prices, spiked dramatically, much more so than oil, in Asia and Europe, a lot of the poorer countries, especially in Asia, have done fuel switching, gas to coal, the wrong way for carbon. So I think there's a tension there. I feel that both directions will have some staying power. I think we are seeing evidence of some of the increase in interest rekindled, and especially internationally, electric vehicles, for example. I think China is going to export more EVs. They're going to export more solar panels. They're going to export more batteries. They're going to export more wind turbines, frankly. But the switch to coal is also real. And I think that once that switch has been made, you will see some of those countries, Southeast Asia, et cetera, sticking with that for quite a while. So it's a mixed bag. Again, history, in terms of the inflection point, history is not overly encouraging, but I do think this is, as I said, a different time technologically, economically with clean energy. So I think it'll stick a bit more this time.
Right. Well, I mean, even seeding the ground, then seeding the point that low carbon is energy security. I mean, maybe it wasn't an inflection point, but it's an important marker today still.
Right.
So maybe just to zoom in on fuels a little bit, because oftentimes the conversation jumps straight to the power sector, to electrification, but you like to talk, I've heard you talk many times about the reality that final energy consumption is largely fuels still. And again, there's an obvious case. The price of jet fuel went up in parts of Asia. You couldn't access liquefied petroleum gas, for cooking. And so, I mean, do you think that this is the moment where folks, put the money in to build out the infrastructure and R&D for fuels?
Yeah, let me come to that. But first, just note that I think the closure of Hormuz has really focused a lot of people for the first time on the idea that it's not just oil and gas, but it's also a lot of the products associated with that. That's come into many commodities. Helium for chip makers, fertilizers has become a big story, et cetera. So the disruptions go beyond the energy sector, although a lot of this is derivative products from the energy sector in the Gulf. Now, going to fuels, I think that's a very important point. First of all, there's no doubt that electrification is the lead horse in addressing climate. And we've made a lot of progress. I mean, clearly renewables, wind, solar, storage, for example. There's a lot of interest now in nuclear power as a low-carbon baseload source. Lots of interest in engineered geothermal. But the reality is, globally, it's not much more than 20% of energy delivered to useful ends comes from electricity. So it's growing, but the reality is most energy in the world, in the United States it's about 2/3 as opposed to 4/5, but most energy in the world is coming from fuels. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's a fact that we have not had anything like the success in producing affordable, scalable, low-carbon fuels to displace oil. The reality is that oil is an incredibly effective fuel if it weren't for that little nasty carbon emission stuff. I can't resist using my physicist background to say that a gallon or a liter of gasoline has 4 times the energy of a liter of liquid hydrogen. So the volume density is much higher, and yet you can manage it at atmospheric pressure, ambient temperatures, et cetera. It's really, really hard to beat. The only counterexample is if you want to travel vertically in a rocket, the mass energy density of liquid hydrogen is higher than gasoline. So you prefer that if you're going vertically. But horizontally, you can't. It's tough to beat oil. And the reality is, we were mentioning earlier that if you look at advanced cellulosic biofuels, for example, there was an enormous interest in that starting around 1980 in response to the oil embargoes. And there was a huge push to develop those advanced biofuels. Well, it's been almost 50 years since without much success. And all of those initial researchers went to develop drugs because it was a lot easier and a lot more lucrative. So fuels is unfortunately, we don't like to talk about it enough. We need a lot of innovation on the fuel side. They're going to be here for a long time, even as we electrify, and we're just not there.
Well, of course, trying to be sort of cognizant of where we are in the Midwest, there is an interesting opportunity, as you said, with biofuels. if folks will get the R&D right.
Well,
commit
to say something that's very unpopular, but the reality is the one area of liquid fuels where actually there has been quite a bit of progress, and there's a lot more progress that to be had, is corn ethanol. Speaking of the Midwest.
We're the right place to say that, right?
Of course, and it's reasonably affordable. It just won't scale.
Yeah.
So it still won't answer the mail as a scalable, affordable approach. But the reality is, and I have to admit, I did not realize this until we did some research on this 2 years ago, that corn ethanol now has about 58% of the carbon intensity of a petroleum-based fuel, and maybe more significant, there are 3 approaches, including like carbon capture and sequestration at the biorefinery, planting row crops, climate favorable agriculture, et cetera, that we could go to zero carbon corn ethanol at a pretty low price on CO2 price per ton. But as I say, it still wouldn't scale. So we shouldn't get our hopes up too much, but it is interesting. It's the counter story.
Yeah, that's a good counter story. I want to maybe just reflect, as I started, there's a lot of geopolitical upheaval during your time as Energy Secretary, and you played an influential role as a negotiator, convening the G7 to deal with the Ukraine issue at the time. The U.S. has a different global posture today, one might say more of an instigator in some ways than sort of the sort of voice trying to calm things in some contexts. What are the implications of the new U.S. posture for energy markets and, by extension, climate?
Well, in 2014, when that invasion of Ukraine took place and we revisited energy security, the very first statement, the very first, at least non-trivial statement in the directive emphasized that energy security was a collective responsibility among allies and friends. Now, today, of course, we've seen that the Hormuz situation, has affected the United States directly only in the increase in oil prices, which is a global price. And so even though we are, quotes, energy independent, we're not really, because we are subject to the oil price excursions. But like our natural gas prices, I mentioned the big spikes in LNG in Asia and Europe. In the United States, we've seen nothing on the gas price side. But as we said, it's a collective responsibility, and of course, Europe and Japan and South Korea do not have the great natural resources that the United States has, whether fossil or, well, they have sun, they have wind, et cetera. However, that collective statement in 2014 was made in the context of valuing alliances, for example, understanding that the security posture of our allies would be dependent upon their energy insecurity for obvious reasons, and so we should be cognizant of that. Well, today, as we all know, the trust, I would say, in the United States as a valuable partner is not what it was in 2014, to put it mildly. So right now, I think that can have consequences in the sense of where our allies look to be supported in their energy security requirements. And we are seeing evidence that, well, look, for example, Europe has dramatically increased its LNG imports from Russia, despite the fact that the United States has the largest LNG export capacity in the world. I think that probably would look a little bit different if it weren't for the geopolitical realities today. And so the big issue, however, to me, is going to be not in energy per se, It's really going to be that if we go down the path of kind of a global decoupling of China and the United States in many ways, I hate to say it, but I'm not sure I know which way Europe would go. And that would have dramatic consequences in energy, but in everything. And so I think, look, I personally think we need to go back and strengthen our position with regard to alliances and friends. Cuts across so many areas. Another one, by the way, which is not directly on the subject here, but talk about nuclear weapons. Many of our allies and friends certainly have long had the technical capacity to make nuclear weapons, but have not, because they have come under the extended deterrence doctrine, under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. A lot of those countries are re-examining that. So this is highly consequential.
So, I mean, one of the things I love about climate is we can talk about a lot of different things under the umbrella of climate. I want to just close by bringing us back to this climate question, though. I mean, I think you hit out the tension that this upheaval has created, where there's both things that are pushing towards decarbonization, but other things pulling us back. And so I think the trillion-dollar question to just end on very briefly is, how does it net out from a climate perspective? I mean, do you think this will look back at this moment and think that this was a time where we, despite not talking about it in the diplomatic sense, we got serious, or markets took over, or is it too hard to say? What do you think about? How does this all net out?
I personally think the end state is not changed. We will continue to go towards a low carbon economy, maybe in ways that are a little bit different from what was imagined some years ago. For example, I mean, things like carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere are getting elevated dramatically, and I think will rightfully have a much more important place. But I think we're going to get to the same place. But the pace is certainly affected and different. And for example, this high carbon fuel switching, which I believe is going to be there for a while, is an example of, well, it's a step back on the overall global carbon trajectory. But I think the realities are that things like, continuing a warmer world, more extreme weather, et cetera, I think eventually is going to push everyone towards that same end state. I'm afraid we've lost some time. We've already lost time before the Iran war, and now I think these tensions will certainly in the developing world will impede us even more, I think.
Well, thank you for that thoughtful, nuanced conversation. Thank you. Very insightful. Thank you.